Okie back screen. Welcome to the community call of Quadrant of Tuesday, March the 19th. I'm going to switch away from this so you can see the notes. It seems we only have one thing on the agenda, Limitador Redis and the cloud. Sounds exciting. Take it away, Mr. Alex.
Yeah, I linked on that thing like the latest measurement, I think. Oh no, it's all the measurements that we did and so forth. So just quick context. The idea is to leverage cloud provider Redis-like storages to enable sharing counters across multiple clusters, right? So unsurprisingly, physics applies, which means that you get to latency figures for doing a single read across regions in the 10th, possibly in the hundreds of millis, depending where the data sits and what we need to do. So there's a few things that we figured out, like this. Or actually, those graphs, I don't know how interesting they are. It's all like quote unquote easy stuff, things that we can fix to bring this latency down. But most importantly to me is, however we cut this, in the end, you still end up with the worst case scenario, which is a single round trip to another region, which, as I said, leads you in, I think the worst case scenario on Amazon is in the 300 millis. So that on the data plane is obviously more or less acceptable. And so all the way down in this thread, there's a few action items that we plan on working on in the coming week to sort of make that a little bit better. And I guess it's possibly interesting that people know about this problem, but most importantly, out of that, we need, well, let's say I put on myself to put up an RFC that hopefully can be discussed next week, that will show the knobs that will expose to people. So people are Quadrant users, for them to tweak their deployment. I guess the most important one of them is infrastructure rate limits. Because so on every possible read, let's say like what in Limitador we call qualified counters. So counters are qualified by some kind of variable. So think of your API key, your user ID, or whatever. In the case of the absence of that counter in your local region, like you would pay the overhead of going to wherever the data sits. But for infrastructure rate limiting counters, this makes no sense because one, they're never qualified. Two, they're certainly very dependent on your cluster, right? The piece of infrastructure that you're trying to protect. So having those sit anywhere else than in that cluster seems to be not really reasonable. So we need to find a way to express that at the rate limit policy, I guess. So either in the form of another CRD, that would be infrastructure rate limiting policy or whatever. And that has been currently unaddressed. We toyed with the idea to qualify the counters with the cluster ID so that it would be local. But back to my point, you would get to see jitter with a max latency of however bad going to your cluster is, plus why would you pay this overhead? Because you only care about local values for your cluster, right? So that's the biggest question mark I have on my list. And I guess I'll try to come up with one or more proposals, and then at some point we'll probably want to decide something on how we want to expose that to to rate limit policies effectively at the quadrant layer. All that stuff that you see on that issue concerns itself with limitador internals and how limitador deals with that, but obviously that all needs to be surfaced up. Yeah, I guess, are there any questions with regards to all that work or anything? But other than that, that's what I had for this. Just wanted to shed some light on the work that not I have been doing, but mostly Higuski and Diddy have been doing in running those tests in different scenarios. You'll find the scenarios at the top of that list. But so even though there are 6 tasks remaining, by the way, since we did see that we confirmed the hypothesis that it's effectively always the worst case, that's the figure that you see at the end, by the way. So we use this service that's called cloudping.co that effectively shows you runs every day sort of latency tests across all the different AWS regions. And in the case of a single counter that has not yet reached its limit, that's more or less what you see. So it maps to that. So we don't plan on running further tests that are listed there because like we keep on seeing the same results. So we know like Amazon doesn't do anything magic. We probably will want to rerun those tests when we have support for Azure though, because Azure apparently has better support for active setups and so forth that AWS doesn't offer, pretending to be Redis.
You go first.
I just wanted to ask a question about the infrastructure rate limiting. So you said there will be local counters, which makes sense because it's the limit for the local gateway. But is there any use case for storing those counters, do you think, or not?
I'm not sure what you mean by storing. So
like longer storage than in memory, as in like into Redis or into an actual database store.
I didn't really say anything about that. So right now, worst case scenario, you end up setting up 2 storages. So today, when you start Limitador, you need to specify what kind of storage you want to use for your counters, right? But today it's a single one, and we're sort of piggybacking on the cached Redis one to implement. Oh yeah, maybe that's another thing that I should mention. Yeah, so we had a cached Redis implementation. I did open a branch with some ongoing work that just uses the plain Redis storage, which means that for every request, it's going to go to Redis to figure out what to do with that request. Obviously, when that Redis sits 300 milliseconds away, that's not an option, right? So we are falling back to using the work that had been started on in-memory within Limitador caching layer that sits in front of the Redis that now can sit further away. I had started another branch that also deals with the partitioning problems. So in case your Redis isn't available anymore, that your entire service doesn't go down, I'm going to fold that work inside the Redis cache implementation. So with all that being said, one option that I'm considering is that if it is a flag that says use storage local, use auto storage, let's say remote, whatever, right? You could configure those to be both Redis, right? So, but one would be Elastic Cache, cached Redis that sits very far away, and your local counters would still be stored in Redis, right? So today, that's one location where one way that we could tackle that problem that's pretty easy and simple to do in Limitador because yeah, limitador doesn't care, right? So in the code, it's all abstracted away, whether you store in memory, in Redis, and in Finispan, in Redis cached, whatever. So now you would just need kind of to have a fork in the road that says to which storage you go depending on something. So that could be that.
Okay, that makes sense. So, like I guess if you might expose that just theoretically as like a counter strategy, something like that, right? And or a limit strategy, probably a better word for that. Where each limit can decide whether it's a local limit or a global limit, maybe.
That would be one way, or you just specify like a list of storages and you say limit goes use storage A.
Right.
Like it doesn't even need to be semantic attached to them necessarily. But yes, that's one way of doing it.
Okay, yeah. So just that's what I thought the answer might be. That we have two option for a second storage, which would be on the cluster potentially. Okay, thank you.
Somebody else had a hand
Yeah,
up, and I
that was
don't know
me.
what that was. Oh, okay.
So, probably not possible, but just like wondering if the unit of the limit tells us enough to know that this is infrastructure or business rate limiting. Like I'm thinking second minute, infra day. Not true.
Possibly. Like, yeah, maybe that again, as I said, like I can't put this all as options in the RFC, right? We could say that everything is pressed at seconds, right? Second also, so limitador doesn't care, right? So I think if I remember right, I don't think I'm wrong.
Right, you could express days in second.
It's a second granular, like everything is in
Right,
second effectively,
right.
right? So that's the way that this works.
Okay.
But we could absolutely say anything that's below, I don't know, 10 seconds or whatever, we will never store anywhere else than in memory, right? Think about the 1 second one, right? That one sort of makes sense when you think about it because, right, if you go down by the time you come back up, like probably your counters don't matter that much anymore, right? Now, the question that I would ask in return would be, does it make sense to force people to express all their rate, like infrastructure rate limiting policies in per second or per below some threshold? That doesn't make sense. And honestly, I don't know.
So I can also imagine a solution where you actually completely split it into its own policy, and we have like next to limitador, we have planificador. Well, we have limitador, but we have like a different kind of policy, like a plans policy or a bucket policy. I don't know, a policy that is for business kind of, that's different.
Yeah, that's I flipped it the other way around with having, infrastructure rate limits and then rate limits. Yeah, the CR. Anyways, like, yeah, all that works. I'm more than happy to hear more ideas, and I'm actually writing those down. I'll put them in as if only alternatives in the RFC, and then we can see what makes most sense. I guess again at that layer, it's less about the implementation than what we expose to the user that makes sense for them, whatever that means, and that closes the least amount of doors for us to iterate and provide better, or let's say more complete solution in the future.
So Alex, like the thing that Craig just said made me think, that's actually a really good idea. It could solve other problems for our distributed use case, which is basically if we can assign counters to different upstream Redis servers, basically like a local one or a remote one that's like a central one, that would be super sweet because I think generally like a counter will likely be highly local to a cluster most of the time, right? Like a client ID, right, will typically come in on the same region all the time, right? So if those counters could be assigned to a Redis server and we have multiple of those like in different regions, and we can also move the location of where that counter is assigned to, right? then even if it was like at a remote counter, we start like a remote location, we start seeing a client IDs like only being accessed from this one region, maybe we move the location of that counter to be local to it. You see what I'm saying?
Yes.
It would require like something tracking where does the counter live, right? So you need another like map somewhere to do this.
But just to map it to what you said at the beginning, so what Craig said. So are you thinking about sort of only two storages, meaning the local and remote, and then for some reason you could say, hey, I never see this counter anywhere else, so I'm going to store it only locally, and then when the need arises, I'm sort of promoting it to distribute it.
I was kind of thinking if we go like this fully distributed model, like every delimiter has his local Redis, right? That's accessible remotely. You see what I'm saying? So like the counter is going to live on one of the clusters. The question is who owns the counter right now? Like that's the new layer that would need to be added. So like when a counter is first like used and created, you look up to see, hey, where does this counter live, right? And if it doesn't live anywhere because it doesn't exist yet, you just create it locally and you record, oh, that counter now lives here, right? And it stays there. And like if another cluster, a different cluster tries to use that counter, says, oh, you live over there. Now that cluster has to do remote Redis calls to get the counter. He's going to incur the latency, right? But then we can do things like, okay, we know that these counters are, you know, we know where they live. And if we track a little bit of how often they're being accessed by each cluster, at some point we can make a decision, hey, even though this counter was created in cluster A, it hasn't been accessed in cluster A in 2 minutes, and it's being accessed by cluster B a lot. Let's move it over there. And so now that counter, even though it was having like bad latency, now it moved over, it's going to have good latency. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. Like, sounds good. The question is, how do you share that metadata, I'm going to call it, right?
Yeah, it probably is like you probably have to elect either have a different store to track that metadata or have one of the Redises be the master Redis that basically tracking counter locations and like usage frequency and shit like that.
Yeah. So that's one way. And this is where then I get uneasy because I'm thinking that falling back again to a CRDT like structure, like a grow only counter that gets replicated only when needs arise, and then every independent limitador only talks to a storage, again, whatever it is, whether it's Redis, local, or you're in memory, doesn't really matter. But stores that metadata, and then you achieve, you get rid of the coordination problem. And because everything you're describing, we can do that way on a sort of a push versus pull model, and replicate where need be, or let's say at different frequencies, because you see that because it's never completely black or white, right? It's I think that the example that you use, right, where a counter lives in one location, is mostly used there but still used elsewhere as well, and then all of a sudden gets mostly used elsewhere and only we discussed that yesterday, right? The typical example for that, in my experience, certainly for human driven stuff, which mostly in the end that's what happens, is time zones, right? Where like the peak hour for something is different throughout the day, and so that the usage patterns, the data locality patterns, change over 24 hours. So I'm not saying it's a bad idea. I just feel we're moving more and more to the coordinated Redis, or to a shared like coordinator that right now would be this Redis shared Redis instance, which I guess makes sense, but it defeats like one scenario, which is the hybrid cloud one, right? So everything we do right now is cloud provider bound, meaning that this Elastic Cache, if you use Elastic Cache to solve your problem, you're bound to Amazon, and you cannot add a cluster in Microsoft's cloud. So again, not saying it's a bad idea. Actually, I think it's fun, but certainly further out, that's for sure. Because of the timelines we're looking at. But then also, I'm more and more thinking that getting rid of the coordinator is interesting.
When
Because
you say
of the
coordinator, what do you
sorry.
mean? Who's the coordinator? Are you talking red on like
Well, in your case, it would be that, and what you just described is the so it's a pool model. So the shared data structure, effectively, whatever it holds, right? Whether it's the counter or the metadata,
Yeah.
sits in that shared Redis that's accessible from anywhere, right? So it becomes your single point of failure, effectively, right? Because now you have to deal with split brains, partitions, at the very best.
Yeah.
And all that, right? And what I'm saying is, if we fall back to data structures that we can replicate where needs be and only store locally, and have that replication thing async in the background, right? You get rid of that coordination layer. That's one that I think is generally desirable. And two, mostly like decouples us from the cloud provider themselves, right? Because everything we're building right now is portable, let's say, across cloud providers, but doesn't work in a hybrid world.
Okay. So this is like a vision of not needing to use Redis, right? Because we'll do our own.
No, it could absolutely, the data could absolutely be stored in Redis, right? It's effectively, where do you store those data structures and how do you make them replicable, so that you can replicate them without coordination.
You mean the metadata data?
Yeah, or the counter, right? So, like that's the example I keep on using for the counters, right? Because initially I had PN counters. Yeah, that's not shared in here, but let's say discussions we had with Andrew and whatever, and the limit that was sort of agreed upon is that shared counters wouldn't be editable. So that means they're monotonically increasing. Always, right? They can't go down. So effectively a grow only counter effectively is a fancy vector clock, right? Lets you replicate that data all over. And now if you hold in there the what every actor observes as the growth rate of the counter, you can then make decisions how often you replicate it to any given location, right?
Yeah.
Anyways, but I think in either way, right? Whether we go one way or the other, at this stage, that's certainly for future work. But that's the interesting stuff that I think we should sort of keep in the back of our head when we think about how we show like enable the user to make use of them, right? So ideally, I think data locality shouldn't be any of the user's concern, and we just do the right thing. That being said, expressing a infrastructure rate limit that could be qualified uses some kind of a qualifier that you want to keep local to a cluster and shouldn't be shared because reasons, I think still makes sense, but maybe I'm wrong. So how do we enable the user to express those things without leaking too much of the implementation details so that we can have our solution evolve into something more nice?
I can also even thinking in the case of business motivated rate limits that it's not even a limit, right? It could be that you have a contract with your customer that you pay this amount of money if you stay under that limit. If you go over that limit, you start paying extra per so many. Like the behavior could be completely different from infrastructural rate limiting in that sense.
You mean in the sense that they wouldn't limit?
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
well,
different
then
from this problem.
yeah, I was about to say then probably it's not a rate limit policy problem. Though that being said, I think being able to audit what happened will be also a requirement for all of this, because in the case of a
Definitely.
partition, right? So when, and let's be honest, it happens, right? It happens to Amazon multiple times a year. Like, you will need to able to know what the heck happened.
Yes,
in the
or you
different
will need
clusters,
to be,
right?
you want to be able to prove to the customer that he actually did those requests.
Or
If they
that, yes.
don't want to pay, for example. Yes, definitely. Yeah, it's also like I can also even imagine how local rate limits could inform global rate limits. Like if something goes on at a high rate in a certain cluster, then you know that you might actually probably have some global rate limits that otherwise you can be quite relaxed about. You can divide them. Like it's not going to matter so much until, but suddenly something might reach its limit at the global rate limiting, at the longer running rate limits that you then want to inform based on what happens locally. Not sure if I make myself clear, but
No, it wasn't clear to me,
it
but
doesn't
I
matter.
certainly but yes, I can imagine cases where something happening in one cluster could inform how smarter things could be done in a different cluster. So
Yeah.
that I can easily imagine.
Anyway, let's move on, right? Or is there other people who wanted to talk? No, I don't think so.
That was dismissive, but good. No, I don't think so.
No,
Nobody cares. You're right. It's boring.
No, I'm just saying this because Craig added another item to the list, and we're halfway time-wise.
Mine's going to be quick. It's just an FYI for people to go have a look at this new architectural overview. It's using distributed DNS now as well, so got new components in there. DNS operator. It talks about OCM as an add-on rather than as a sort of capability that you can add on rather than as core. Things like that. Got some fancy new diagrams. I started to really like Miro actually. Didn't like it at first, but I guess that's just because it was new.
Why JPEG though? That doesn't make sense. This format for this kind of picture it should be PNG or JPEG is for photos.
Good question. I just clicked the first one on the list. You can add your comments, Thomas. I'll potentially change them. Anyway, yeah. If you're interested, go have a look, add some comments. If there's stuff you want to see in more detail, put that in there as well. Like the stuff that like Alex was showing and stuff around the distributed DNS like deep dive. That's not really what this is made for. It's more like a higher level look at how things are laid out and that kind of thing. But I certainly could have missed something, or there may be more detail that we want to add. So yeah, go for it. That's it.
Cool. Okay, back to rate limiting.
Actually, I did have a question for Alex while we're here. Limitador operator, does he actually look at the limits? Is there so there's a rate limit policy? Is there a limit CR as well that then gets turned into the config map, like an intermediary, or is it
Yes,
from rate limit?
there was for sure. It's kind of weird. I would need to relook into it myself, but if you want, I can send you the link to what it is and where it is and whatever.
Okay.
But the rate limit policy is being handled by Kuadrant, right? Then we publish, I think, limits actually is what it is to the operator, and the operator is the one that then mounts, like writes all that inside a config map that gets mounted on Limitador's file system, and Limitador is the one monitoring that file for changes and then applies those changes in batches.
Yeah, okay. So basically, if you go back to that tab again, Thomas, that pitch you had, kind of have that, except I called it rate limits. I thought there was another CRD. I called it rate limits, but yeah, okay. So it seems like I probably have that right.
I'll double check and I'll point to the things. Yeah, sorry, my memory is very bad with those things, and we haven't touched any of that in a long while. Yes, there you go. Oh, no, yes, is it inside the limitador? Because we also went back and forth with that. Yeah, it looks like it's all inside the limitador. CR, but that
Okay.
yeah, that makes sense, and that has the limits. Yes, so there you go.
Limits draw. Okay.
Yeah, but that I think that's a thing, and we did and undid that a few times. Sorry, I'm reading the thing as I'm saying this at the same time. Yes, and that has the rate limits. Yes, so I confirm, and it was interesting in the sense that this CRD sort of has both the how would I put it, like the deployment stuff as well as the limits, if that makes
Okay.
sense. But in the case of limitador, it's all in one and the same anyways.
Right.
Though arguably, because we then did the whole HAL monitoring thing, like you can change the limits without needing to change redeploying limitador, right? Because of the mounting thing.
Okay. And I think okay, so I probably just need to update this diagram a little bit. Then I imagine that
Well, no, I think it no, that looks, or at least maybe I want to understand it the way. Oh, because of the rate limits, CRDs?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, yeah, no.
yeah, okay.
We had
Okay.
those though, but we got rid of them. And then there was discussion to bring them back in. And anyways, that layer is a bit fuzzy.
All right. Well, 99% of the way there. I can update that. I was guessing on that one. That's why I wanted to check.
Yeah, if you go to the limiter operator repo, and then there's API v1 alpha 1, and then limiter types are in there, you'll see it's all
Okay.
yeah,
Thanks.
the limits are part of the limiter spec themselves. Yeah, can just point you to the thing. Hey, how's this? And the answer is in the chat. That's it, I guess.
I think so.
All right.
Thanks,
Well,
everybody.
thanks for
Any
running this.
questions? See you next time. Take care.
Thank you. See ya.
Bye.
Good.